Welcome to the last day of the DDD. So usually the last day in the morning it's a little bit down, but that's why we brought our distinguished guest, Professor Linda Forst from Chicago, who hopefully will wake you up. I would like to also His Excellency, Lieutenant General Albert Kendagor, the Ambassador of Kenya to Israel. Thank you very much. Later today we'll have His Excellency, the Ambassador of Ethiopia. I would also want to acknowledge we have here, and I want to make it a tradition. I'm also the head of the School of Sustainability and Climate Change, and we the National Climate Youth Conference that we are also doing collaboration with Kenya. And from that, we had a collaboration with schools all over Israel, and we had a great school and a teacher from a high school in Beersheba. So we have here 6 high schoolers or 5? 7 high school children. So let's give them the thank you in English. And they came also to hear you, but in general, so thank you very much. So we have, I think, an exciting program today. Hopefully everything will fill up soon. Participants in our conference from 39 different countries. So thank you.
Wow, that's beautiful. Congratulations on that. Great to see everybody here, and I hope I can keep you awake for the last day. I'm going to talk about climate and labor migration specifically. So this is a little detour maybe from much of the discussion and work that's been described in the conference so far, but I think maybe it's more accessible to everybody. Worried about climate, and we pay attention to immigrants. There's a lot of attention in this crowd to immigrants, so hopefully this will be accessible to all of you guys. This work was partly funded by the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, which lives in the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in the United States, and it's still alive, thank goodness. We've gotten a few communications from the federal government. One communication was a questionnaire asking us if we got another communication asking if we include diversity, equity, and inclusion in any of our work. And of course, anyway, our grant is still going because of the responses to those surveys from the federal government. I also do public health surveillance, occupational injury surveillance for the state of Illinois. There are 13 million people, and the workforce is about 6.2 million in the state of Illinois, and we collect data analyses on work-related illnesses and injuries in our state and contribute to a national, effort. And then I also funded Total Worker Health Center, and we do outreach to immigrant communities in the city of Chicago. I have no other. First, I'll give you some information on labor and migration in the world. Excuse me. And I'll talk about, I'll give you a climate framing for this talk, so you guys are all experts on this. But I'll give you a framing that we can use to talk about employment. I'll talk a little bit about adverse effects and human rights issues vis-a-vis labor migration. And I'll give you some categories as a way to think about groups that are at risk and how we might address their issues vis-a-vis policy and practice. And then I'll give you a little bit of a research agenda for this realm, and I'll talk a tiny bit about my research at the end. Okay. So here's a little bit of data. If you look at the blue bars there, the number of international migrants in general, and what is it, the purple graph of the global population. So this is in general. So from 1960 to 2024, we went to less than 100 million immigrants moving around the world to something more like 300 million. And that they comprise 3 to 4% of the global workforce now. And then if you look at that little red star that I embedded up there, I can't see that. Migrants, and that data is from 2022. All the references are at the bottom of the slide, and you can have these slides to use however you'd like to. There are 284.5 million migrants in the world, and if you take a look at the green ring around the circle, that's the number of migrants in the labor force around the world. And if you look at this little brown thing here, those are people that are unemployed in the labor force, but the around there is people who are employed. And then just to say that there are 255.7 migrants of working age, that's 15 years old and above. And so even if they aren't migrating because of work or for work, they're also eligible to be in the labor force. Where do these people come from? Mostly, I'm sorry, what is the destination country? I'm going to show you the destination countries first. So the United States is actually the biggest destination country of migrants. Next to Europe, and then it goes down pretty much from there. You can see regions in the country. The third most is the Arabic Peninsula, close by here. And the sending countries in order are this. So the vast majority, about 18 or 19 million, come from India, and then we go down to about 12 from China and Mexico, and Ukraine, Philippines, Russia are the next lowest. And what are the demographics of the workforce? Migrant workers globally by sector and sex in 2022. So you see the men in the top layer, and service sector, so around 61% work in services if they're men, but you can see if you look at the next row, women make up about 80% of women who migrate for work in the service. It swaps order for industry, manufacturing, that is. Okay, now you guys know more about this than I do. So what are the climate stressors on human population? Acute extreme weather events, they can cause immediate displacement and destruction. And so they're in sort of a different category, I would say, or a separate category from the slow onset. The avalanches and acute heat events are critical in sort of immediately unhousing people and making them countries and forcing them to leave. And then there are slow onset types like drought, sea level rise, desertification, and increasing temperatures and heat waves. And so those happen more slowly over time, and maybe there's a little more time to anticipate the needs of people who are vulnerable to those. I'll just take a really quick detour and talk about the effects of heat on the human body. So I'm going to focus most slides. As you probably all know, we have a lot of stasis, all of our biological 37.6 degrees Celsius, and when our electrolytes are balanced, and anything that perturbs that makes everything work less well than optimal. And so what happens when somebody is exposed to extreme heat? The core temperature heats up above 37 degrees, and that sets off mechanisms to dissipate the heat. What happens is the blood vessels in the periphery dilate, and the heart beats faster to pump blood out of the core to the periphery so that moved out of the core organs. And that puts a stress on the heart because the heart has to beat fast to do that. We also sweat a lot to dissipate heat, and that means we lose a lot of water, and so and that also affects our organs. And because the blood is moved from the core to the periphery, we also are moving red blood cells to the periphery and away from the core organs, the heart, the kidneys, the brain, and so on. And so they could suffer a deficit of oxygen in the same. There's an epidemic of chronic kidney disease in the world. It was noted in the beginning, in Nicaragua and El Salvador, I think. They saw an increased incidence of death from kidney disease, kidney failure among young men. So that was an oddity, and they began to investigate that. Workers, and so it set off quite a lot of research on chronic kidney disease. It's called CKDU, chronic kidney disease of undetermined origin. But I think that the data more and more are showing that this is due to recurrent heat stress, and acute kidney injury. Recurrent acute kidney injury that keeps insulting the kidneys until it causes them to fail. And you can take a look at the right side of this picture up here. The red is the countries where this research effort also in South Asia around this. They're looking more at chemicals, and they believe that pesticides and other chemicals might be related, causally related, but the people in Central America do not think that. They think it's all about heat. So you can read that literature. The International Labor Organization produced this book of data, which is really interesting and might serve you guys. There are more than 2.4 million workers, and 71% of the global workforce is exposed to heat. There are over 22 occupational injuries per year that are attributed to heat exposure on the job. There are almost 19,000 deaths yearly, same problem. And there's also a decrease in 2 to 3% of productivity for every 2 to 3 degrees increase above 20 degrees Celsius. How do we mitigate adverse health effects of heat on working populations? In the US, there's a big campaign. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration and our Department of Labor has this program called Heat, Rest, and Shade, and has written temporary standards to get employers to institute a program. This is particularly important for ag workers, rest and shade breaks. There was an emergency temporary standard in the US that was about to go into effect at the end of 2024, but then we got a new presidential administration, and that's currently on hold. There are also heat acclimatization practices. So human beings, if we are become completely acclimatized to that, and what that means is that we have mechanisms, physiologic mechanisms to conserve water, to maintain our electrolyte balance, and so on. And that lasts as long as you keep working and being exposed to heat. That change lasts. When people take a week or so off of work and they come back to work, they're sort of at ground zero again, and they need another 1 to 2 weeks to reacclimatize. And so, as an intervention, one can put in working in a high heat environment. Other simple approaches are stopping work at the hottest part of the day, paying people by the hour and not by the piece. So what happens in agriculture in the US for sure, and probably in other places at all, also, is that people are paid by the number of pounds of oranges, the number of baskets they get filled up. They are not paid by the hour. And so that induces people to work in order to have a better paycheck. And that contributes to heat-related illness as well. And then implementing training in a buddy system is a good intervention approach. And there are a lot of great studies now in the US, probably elsewhere, also, where workers get training and they look out for each other and recognize the signs of heat-related illness and so on, and can mitigate the effects before they're bad. There could be legislation to enforce these practices. There is patchy legislation in the United States, and in general is pretty patchy. But we know what we need to do, so we need to get that enforced. Here are other climate events and adverse health effects related to them. I probably don't have to tell you all these things. Most of them are traumatic effects of flooding, avalanche, expose people to particulate matter, so they're inhaling particulate matter in that setting. Cold exposure can cause frostbite. And all of these items can cause psychological trauma, forced displacement, and loss of economic activity. And so dealing with the psychosocial aspects of climate are really important as well, both for people who stay locally and people that are leaving because of it. You possibly recognize the I try to match up the issues that come about for workers as a result of climate effects with the SDGs, because employment is always a sidelined, I feel, in discussions of epidemiology and climate and environment and so on, that workers really are the guinea pigs, so to speak, or the canaries in the mine, as we like to say, that workers are allowed to be exposed to adverse more than communities and regular populations. Everybody, legislation is all over whole communities, but when business interests are involved, there are less protections in place. And so I map these. You can check them at your leisure, but I try to map the major issues that come about as a result of climate effects on the SDGs. Okay, so I'm gonna take a little detour now and talk about 3 groups of labor migrants as they relate to the climate crisis. There is climate precipitated migrant workers, so a bad workforce, the working population to leave the country, There are climate impacted migrant workers. Those are workers that, people that leave their home country for a variety of reasons, and on the way they interact with climate, their health, and also when they get to their destination country, they work in occupations that expose them to heat, like construction, agriculture, and so on. And then finally, there are working to mitigate climate effects. So I think this is a really smart framing of this. Amy Liebman from Migrant Clinicians Network came up with this, and I think it's a really useful model to think about climate employment and health. So here are the climate precipitated migrants. These are vulnerable working age adults, often the breadwinners of their family. There's some kind of sudden or extreme weather that's happening over time, and the conditions in their home country no longer allow them to stay in place. Their water is contaminated, their food and housing are insecure, and there are limited employment opportunities, and those folks have to leave their home country in order to stay alive, really. So you can see some people biking in a flood, somebody on dry land in the middle trying to drink water, and then the right is a landslide in Colombia, in South America. Here are the climate impacted migrants. So again, part one of this group is people that have heightened vulnerability during migration. So their travel is dangerous, there are adverse weather conditions and unsafe transportation can be hazardous and difficult, and they often have mental health needs that are unmet. There's also a lot of criminal activity as people are moving across borders, extortion, forced labor, human trafficking, and so on. Not uncommon in the world, unfortunately. And then immigration authorities are often unsympathetic, and so workers are coming, or migrants are coming to a different country, and at the border they're met by immigration officials and they're turned back in the country that they're going to in terms of asylum. When people leave war zones and have trauma in their backgrounds, or they face trauma as they migrate, often there are asylum programs. There are not asylum programs, and that is, in the United States at least, that is not a condition for which somebody would be granted a visa. And so on the left you see the Darien Gap, which is really famous and in the newspaper every couple of months in the United States. People are crossing from Colombia, South America, across the border, to Panama and coming north toward the United States, and it's really dangerous. Jungle area, both environmentally and socially. There are a lot of bad guys out there. And then on the right, you see kids that are being trafficked. This, which I've already described, is climate impacted workers. So these are people with increased vulnerability after they migrate. That is when they get to the destination country. Again, the impacts of climate are not recognized as reasons to grant asylum or citizenship or any kind of work status. And they also take jobs, they take bad jobs because of it. They take difficult jobs, agriculture, construction, cash economy kinds of jobs where they're particularly vulnerable because of them. There's also job ghettos where people land in communities that are like them, people that came from they're getting the same jobs that their immigrant predecessors got, and often they're shunted into bad jobs because that's where they gain access. And so heat, air quality, housing are all really big problems. We've done a little bit of work. It's very patchy, mocked up housing all over the place in terms of stability and health promoting and so on. There's often crowding. The physical, physical part of the housing isn't great, nor is the social part of the housing. And then often housing is owned by their friends over or do what they want to do. And there's this other phenomenon of man camps where there are a lot of men living in one place, and prostitution is brought into that place, drugs, alcohol, and so on. A lot of problems with that. And then finally, this is a phenomenon that I didn't really know about in the United States, and I don't know if it exists. Remediation or climate reaction. On the top left, you see a crew from Mexico. So this is a legal that came to help with flood in central Texas a few months back. So that's sanctioned, and those folks are safe, and they're going to go back home, and the governor of Texas appreciated their coming to help. But take a look at the guy on the right who's fighting a fire. They're supposed to fires, but there are a lot of mitigation activities around fighting fires. You see the guy in the bottom left is a Spanish speaker, and he's cutting brush to prevent firefighting. The guy on the far right bottom is a immigrant worker who works in residential construction. So there's tons of immigrants working in residential construction everywhere in the world. And as you all probably know, residential construction is much less regulated. You rarely see these people in commercial construction, big buildings, and operating engineers, but you see them putting roofing on housing, doing plumbing and painting and so on. So the guy on the right does that. And then there's a whole crop of so-called resilience workers. They're looking for day labor type jobs. They congregate in certain places like Home Depot parking lots and lookalikes in more rural areas. And they're called upon to deal with acute climate effects, a new flood, a new fire, or some other climate effect that needs workers. And so they move from disaster to disaster. Okay. So this is a model that talks about all these phases. I'm not going to talk about them, but I wanted to put this in here so you guys could, have the slides and look at them and think about this. But again, I think what is always missing from these models is the integral importance of work, employment. They don't just happen to work. They're working because everybody has to work, and they shouldn't be sacrificed because of that. They should be thought of the way you would think of any displaced population, where you would look at the issues that are particularly important and critical to them in their circumstance, and you would work to mitigate that. So I made this little model for myself, and I hope that it's convincing to you as well. Are related to one another. If you look at A up at the top left, work is a determinant of health. Workplace hazards, as we all know, challenge health. If you look at B, work is an indicator of health. Those who work are generally healthy. People aren't migrating across the Darien Gate. And so when you're looking at immigrant populations in your home country, they often look healthier, at least at the beginning, than the general population. And then look at C, which is going in the opposite direction. Health is a determinant of work, apropos to what I just said, that unhealthy people really can't do this kind of work. Now take a look over at the relationship between work and migration. Work is a driver of migration, as I just talked about, that economic hardship, and climate. And in the opposite direction, E, migration is a determinant of work, that immigrants are restricted in the work opportunities that would be impacted by that. Now look at the relationships between health and migration, that health is a determinant of migration. Again, only healthy people can migrate. And migration is a determinant of health because migrant workers often only have opportunities in more hazardous jobs, and they also lack social protections that are afforded other workers. So again, migrant workers are generally self-selected for being healthy. They have a lot of mental health. Young, very old people, women may be exploited and trafficked. Healthcare costs vary. So in some countries, workers are entitled to health insurance and healthcare. In the United States, that's often not the case. Our health insurance in the United States comes through our employer. If you're employed informally, you do not have health insurance and you are not entitled to any of the programs that serve poor people. And then healthcare availability and quality vary. When I come here, I think about Israel and how great your healthcare system is, and mostly people are covered one way or another through HMOs or whatever, and that is not the case in the United States, and I would put forward that that's not the case. Problematic, the cost of healthcare. People that are working in agriculture, of course, are living in rural areas and don't necessarily have transportation, and so they can't really get to healthcare even if they need to or want to go there. And then finally, language and cultural access is a problem for all immigrants vis-a-vis healthcare, and I think that was discussed in the other sessions in the health group. Migrants become low-wage workers or so-called precarious workers. So there's this concept of work precarity, a lot of research on this, mainly in Europe, but a lot of my colleagues are engaged with it. And these are employment arrangements that are unstable. The work is temporary, the wages are low, the social benefits, insurance, and so on are non-existent or limited. And this is a whole area of study in the world. Here, I have to present to you the way we in occupational health, I'm an occupational medicine physician, and I do research and teach in a public health school, and I teach environmental occupational health sciences. And so one of the activities, kind of orienting activities for our students, whoever did, and think about physically what you were doing when you were doing that job and what the hazards were that were around you. And then I create a big table on the board in the front, or on the computer. Work history, all occupations, all jobs the hazards of all jobs can be classified into these 5 categories: chemical, physical, biological, biomechanical or injury type hazards, and psycho. And so if you an agricultural worker, they're exposed to chemicals, pesticides, fertilizers, solvents. Their physical exposures are UV radiation, heat and cold. Their biological hazards can be microbes, ticks, parasites, fungi. Their biomechanical and injury hazards could be musculoskeletal hazards. It's hard physical work, or trauma could be traumatic hazards. And then the psychosocial hazards are long hours, harassment, low wages, wage theft, no social benefits, immigration statuses. All of this, but I would challenge you to use this framework and sort of think about the jobs that you yourselves are doing, or when you're talking with other people about their work. People have a lot to say about this. So all of that is about the downstream issues, what people are facing when they're in the workplace. The upstream issues are these: induced migration, which I've spoken about, immigration and work authorization that I don't hear too often anymore, but for example, in the United States, farmers get subsidized to grow a lot of corn, and we flood Central and South America with corn, which is a staple of those countries, and the farmers there can't, we undersell the farmers there, and so we're putting farmers in the... We have an ostrich approach. We all know that we need immigrants to do the work, this kind of work that I've described in this lecture today, but we don't want to set up the pathways, the policies, the practices to support that. So that's a paradox that I think needs to be solved in the world. Immigrant workers are often accepted, EXCEPT, accepted from usual laws, and then occupational safety and health are problematic, and there's a convergence of all these issues are so for you to look at your leisure. And another one, there are deficits, as I've already described, in legislation and regulation and oversight. I've described all of these items, so I'll just proceed. Again, you're welcome to the slides in PowerPoint or PDF. Here are solutions to legislative and regulatory deficits: better regulation, better enforcement. Of course, OSHA in the United States doesn't have jurisdiction over agriculture even. That's done by the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, and so workers are really workers in the United States. And migrants also should be considered in all components of an emergency response plan. They are very vulnerable, often linguistically and culturally challenged, living remote, not plugged in, and so on. And so any plan for mitigation, resilience, response, and all of that needs to consider those. There are a bunch of pathways to support migrants. I have them listed here. And community health centers are a very good way to support migrants because they're often, specifically situated where poor populations are, at least in the United States. And so training that workforce, doing outreach to farm workers, community health workers, and so on can be helpful. Using clinics as a resilience hub, air conditioning in hot weather, and so on would be a good thing. Tell you about our research really quickly. This is a fairly newly funded Center for Agricultural Safety and Health. We're surveying agricultural workers and others in the food service. Germany. She was a Fulbright scholar with us from here when she was doing her PhD, and also with some issues around migrant workers, particularly in agriculture and construction. Another thing that we do is find and report health data on the health of immigrant workforces in the state of Illinois and collaborate with all 50 states. We're working with communities and advocacy groups to address the work-related issues related, that are faced by immigrants. And we're developing intervention studies to prevent heat-related illness through clothing choices in agriculture. We have a policy initiative on mandatory reporting of pesticide poisoning, which doesn't exist in most states in the United States. I want to thank you very much for your attention. Please look at our website, contact me if you'd like to collaborate, you want to come to a school in Chicago, come to university, or just have questions, anything, projects. I'm really happy to interact with you all. Thank you.
So we have time for 2 questions or someone. Yes.
Thank you so much. It was a brilliant presentation. I enjoyed it so much. You didn't mention unions. Why? And what do you think about that?
Yeah, that's great. Labor unions in the U.S. are just starting to pay attention to this workforce. There's been a whole worker center movement in the United States since around 2000, specifically to this workforce. And the formal labor movement, at least in the United States, had been really reluctant to engage with this workforce. The workforce competes like day labor construction workers compete for jobs with formal construction workers. And so there had been real pushback or reluctance to engage. That's changed in the last by I don't work in that realm, which is why I didn't speak about it, but I do think that connection is really critical because they do really understand what the issues and problems might be, and their job is to advocate for workers, so that's a very good thought.